Welcome to another 2MK Team Disc Guidance segment. We've been wrangling with the more advanced bots for most of the week, and we think we finally got something that is a compromise between the difficulty of inputs that you'd have to put in every time and functionality across a total of 4 bots actually today. Without further ado, let us get right into that, therefore. Today we are starting at Gordeau. Even though you can do this input recording on other bots, it's probably best to do it with him. You can equally see it effectively with Nanasae, but there's a couple other things that happen if Gordeau specifically is doing it that help out. So we will consider this the Gordeau type bot. As you know, you cannot see the inputs on screen for the bots, so you're not going to be able to tell exactly what he's doing. But, of course, I will give you the explanation of it, and of course you will find these on our website when we release them. This first input we agonized over a while. It's quite tricky. It has a lot of little nuances in the timing for it, but it's relatively easy to tell when you've got it mostly right and when it's terrible. This is a 4A, 6A plus B, which is a tap, go back to neutral, 6A plus B, which is a hold. Not necessarily a big hold, just long enough for him to start the overhead. And then 2, 3, 6, 9, end. You are aiming to get the TK style motion from crouching up to up forward and end quite quickly so that he can do stuff like this. You generally don't need to do that part of the input until rather late in the animation of the overhead, because it will let him do certain things. This is a slow input for the most part, and it gets very confusing because it's a slow input. It's also unclear, but there is a dashing B in here as well. Two is much simpler. It is just the normal BC force function input, but in this case it goes with an up forward. You are starting at 3 BC, 6, 9, 6, 3, 2, 1, and end. In other words, start at down forward, go to up forward, and quickly roll all the way to down back, and end the recording quickly so that he can do other moves. Technically, if this combines with action 1, he should be able to do his command grab style move, but it's very difficult to test this for some reason. No matter how well both of them are input, it just doesn't seem to come out, mostly because of probably the animations that he uses and the fact that he doesn't have an air version of the same move to reference out of the air. His action 3 was again some work, but we've come up with something relatively interesting. It's also slightly difficult, but you can mess with it as you wish. While he is basically just going to do this charge, the actual input is 6C, 3C, 2C. You are basically mashing these. All of these are hidden within the 6C. The 6C takes quite a while. You're actually holding it a little bit longer so that he does a relatively charged 6C. And then just slide your way to down, hit C twice more on the way. Release everything, input a dash, or just a tap of forward, and end the recording immediately. You care about getting him to do this more so than anything else, because this is important for Nanasae, less important for Hilda and Hyde. But it really changes a lot of things if you cannot do it. Slot 4 is a generally easier input, although the explanation is a little difficult. This is 4 AD, i.e. throw, 1, 2, 3, end. You are going from back throw to down forward. The important thing to understand about this input is that even though he does side switch, you should ignore this side switch. You can ignore what's happening on the screen, focus on the controller. It is a fluid motion from back to what would be down forward if you were far enough away to whiff. You can do this input with a whiff if you feel it will make you more comfortable. And the timing does shift around some things. However, if you do this input while actually grabbing him, you can shift it so that the input itself has a sort of shortcut flicker in it that will occasionally allow certain characters to do DP style motions, the 623 motion. You can choose whether you want this or not. They will still occasionally do it, but you're not aiming to get this to happen. The faster you do the input, the more likely it is. But you shouldn't do it too slowly in order to achieve this, because they'll just spam it all the time. So do be a little careful with it. But you do have some options there. Action 5, thankfully, is quite simple. It is 2A, 6, 6, 2, release the 2, the last 2, and end. That makes the 2 into a double tap. And you get this sort of thing. It's easier to test if it's working by being close enough to block this, which improves his block stun to the point where the dash will happen. Whereas if you're far away, sometimes you'll just keep on doing that. Eventually though, because of the drift in terms of time, he should dash eventually. And you can work out how important this is to get perfect as you go as well. However, we move onward now to the purpose of these bots. All 4 bots today are meant to help you with your defense, but they also have offensive and intercepted parts in here as well. So with that, let's turn on the combined playback and start to demonstrate and talk about how this works. We will start with my play, as my defense is much worse than Amara's. And most of the time we will switch between Hyde and Seth a bit as we discuss it for each of the bots in turn. The current point system, which we're relatively confident at the moment, for Gordeau, is that you need to, first of all, shield your way to winning Vorpal from his attacks. This is usually quite easy. If you, however, shield incorrectly, because he is going to do overhead, he is going to do other things. If you shield incorrectly, you will get guard broken, well, GRD broken. We're still not sure how to pronounce that. And therefore not be able to win Vorpal. But that, what I just did, was effectively 1 point. This is not a quick way to get points, obviously. And as you can see, the current auto regeneration is on right now, so you're not really seeing a lot of stuff there. But you can absolutely do it. And every now and again you will just get a point. He's a fairly important character to learn to do this against, And it's an easy way to get yourself to think about Vorpal and the timing of it. So it's entirely possible, since this is point system A, if you're used to our bots, it's the easiest one. It goes away when you start to play the bot more seriously. You can get the point once every approximately 15-16 seconds. If you get GRD broken, however, won't work anymore. Gordeau also has many moves where he will steal your gauge if he's doing things correctly, and if you mess up, so it is always possible that he will get the points from you. Or rather, prevent you from getting any, because in this case we are not counting any points for Gordeau. But obviously that's not all you'd want to be doing against the bots. While he does do a lot of things, you only really care if he does his overhead and you block it correctly. And you can give yourself the point for literally just blocking the overhead. There does not need to be any punish, just an understanding of what has happened and making sure that you blocked it correctly. This is only his actual 6B overhead. All of this stuff where he's going into the air and doing moves, some of it does need to be blocked standing, some of it does not. If you can get the 2 or 3C in correctly, he will have at least one option for a low. But the main reason that this helps out is because it is instinctive mostly to block low, to avoid certain situations, and if you have the timing right, you're generally fine. But he doesn't do the move that often, so you care only in that sense. You care about blocking it and nothing more. The next point system is slightly different by character, as different characters have different options and things they try to do for this. You're aiming to do some equivalent of your own TK move, your own Tiger Knee style move, or an instant overhead for the characters who have that. And for characters who have their own relatively slower overheads, you're looking to land that. So in Seth's case, this is relatively simple. You can just do this move outright. And if you feel like you want to challenge yourself, you can learn to do instant jump C, which is a lot of characters have instant jump C style things and need to understand how to use them properly. Gordeau does not stay on the ground as much, and he tends to swat you out of the air fairly often. So you have to be fairly careful about when is your opportunity to do this in the first place. A lot of the things he does are actually advantaged, especially if you don't shield them. And the challenge here is the massive amount of execution perfection required to pull some of this stuff off in terms of speed. If you're not used to this type of game, going from making sure you are blocking correctly to shielding correctly to did my opponent go into the air or not to oh, they did go into the air, I hit the thing, I should need to confirm this into something else now. It's not conceptually difficult most of the time, but it is executionally difficult. It can also be some strain on your focus. The final point is simple, tech his throw. He does tend to do things in a way that flows him toward you, and that needs to be teched. That is the type of throw, even though it is technically a chain in one of his moves, we will still count it. He does actually have the capacity to throw you normally, to just dash up and throw you, but you have to get better at the whole thing before this will happen most of the time. Mostly though, you're looking for that moment where he has tried to pull you in somehow. And you are grabbing, he's being strange about it, trying to grab you in some way, and you have to get out of it. This will happen even if the low-ish slash that he does actually catches you. And you definitely want to wait a little bit, because you have extra time to do it, and he won't always throw. This is therefore the hardest point to get. Depending on the rhythm of your character versus his character, different things happen, fairly often as well. And depending on the speed of your inputs, he may spend a lot more time trying to just pressure you than anything else. In fact, it's almost required that you shield somewhat to make him throw often enough to get the points for this consistently. It can also help you get out of the habit of, as I'm doing here, simply pressing throw because you shielded correctly. On good input days, he's a bit easier to deal with in this way, because he will do his moves more cleanly and more obviously, and possibly do a little less of this part. But all bots in this set are advanced. They require a lot of mental focus to make sure that you have everything in mind. They're not the sort of bots we are really suggesting you use early on. Even if you're good at games in general or have good execution, keeping everything in your head to do this correctly can be straining at the minimum. But of course, as you get better, it becomes easier to deal with this sort of thing and not end up too strained. All that, however, is from someone who really doesn't have good defense, so I'll hand it off and discuss it more as Amara does the probably better demonstration of it. Semi-random, semi-random, no, not a playground. That's not. That'll do. Shielding does not need to be done beforehand. It is like Guilty Gear. You simply tap or hold the shield button, in this case D, while being hit, and everything works out fine. Similarly, once you've recognized that your GRD gauge has been broken, you might as well go on the offensive, as you can't really shield in the first place and you can't really get much points any other way. However, as you can see, this button has different effects depending on whether or not you actually are blocking, and can be a little stressful. The game often suggests in the tutorials that you learn certain option selects, and this is a good bot to learn them against. But we won't be going into details on that. Please see the tutorial for option selects, how they work, and the suggested executional ways of inputting them. Learning to count that you have blocked an overhead and nothing else is also a relatively difficult thing to make yourself do properly. Now as you can see, Gordeau does stick to you quite well, and he often violates the feeling of whether or not you should be able to punish things. If you shield correctly, you should be able to punish normally anyway, but a good way to test how well you have shielded is whether or not you can in fact get that instant jump button. I believe Hyde's is actually his jump A. But you can always use your character's actual natural formal overhead in order to deal with it. One of your biggest options to do exactly what I'm talking about will in fact be after you've blocked him doing that particular spin. So even though there is no specific point for punishing that move, it is easiest to think of that as the way to get your points, whereas the others are more so just Gordeau getting to do pressure. Generally, the game is not too affected terribly by you just trying to keep him out. He is capable enough of doing damage to people who are just going, well, no, I don't want you near me just yet, I'm doing my thing. You might be able to get most of your points by winning Vorpal, but there is effectively a time limit on that, and getting hit by Gordeau stuff will eventually become a problem. In this case, it works more so because we are not letting the health actually fall. Since his throws will then also be a little bit more confusing in terms of their timing and spacing relative to most things, it will be much harder to just tech regular throws. However, you may be able to reach that speed at some point. A lot of these are about learning the differences, small differences in block stun, shifts relative to whether you shield or not, and similar. And learning to time your shielding so that you end up actually shielding. Learning the visual cues for this, also important. You're not actually required to combo at all off this overhead in the lower difficulties of the bot. And depending on your character, you may not really be able to do this at all, but you should aim to get some of it in if you can. Similarly, you often need to pay attention to Vorpal to see whether or not you're about to win it. Because if you lose track of that, you can still give yourself the point, of course. You can look down and realize, oh, I have Vorpal, I must have done something right. But as you've just seen, this may actually get flipped in the sense that you don't actually know that you did because of something getting broken. And on top of all that, as you've seen, he can do real command grabs if properly input, and these will also break if you are shielding at the time he attempts to do it. So we will treat him as the advanced bot for defense and awareness of your Vorpal meter. For clarity, you get your GRD gauge broken whenever you shield high against the low, whenever you shield against any throw at all, and of course whenever you shield low against some overhead move. While understanding the spacing for his slide is important, we decided in the end that just having it in the bot for people to get used to and see was enough, and it was not necessary to actually have him do this as his focus. Please, of course, make sure to learn the spacings for where you should or should not attempt to check his slide. Punishing it is not necessarily going to come up a lot. Most players will not put him in a position where you get punishes on this. But there are a couple times, and obviously if you try to check him, you will see them, as he will be disadvantaged enough for this to actually happen. When the inputs are not so great, this bot will use a lot more of Grim Reaper due to the speed with which certain things get combined with dash type motions and so on. But generally it's not too bad unless he's doing it in a combo. If he's just occasionally doing it in neutral or just waking up with it, obviously that's kind of good. Even if only because the other bots of similar things will have those types of movement. But as you can see, very much about sticking to you, very much about making sure you're blocking correctly, and quite often forcing you to learn to shield yourself properly. He has a lot of relatively slow moves that take up a lot of the screen, meaning that you can't really get Vorpal just by approaching, but you can get Vorpal by shielding against them properly. The hard part, of course, being properly. If you do not manage to get the 3C into action 3, obviously you have to worry a lot less about lows, and the bot will be generally less effective. But you can still mostly train knowing that he can do it, and it will shift your perspective for the day probably. So for now, that covers Gordeau. And we'll switch back to Seth in order to move on to the next character. Let's change that first. We were not sure how to handle Hilda because Hilda's a character that works very, very specifically. She's good at space control, but bots are not generally space control things. They do not have the awareness required to lock onto the player and stop them from approaching or anything similar. Yeah, sure. However, if she's input correctly, you can simulate fairly easily the way that Hilda is supposed to be fought by most characters. Her space control is oppressive and basically better than any character in the game. Meaning that there is always a point where you need to be the one that gets in on Hilda, more or less no matter what your character you're playing, except if you are playing Hilda herself, and even then, sometimes you still need to reposition because of her being more so on the offensive. Because you cannot always be picky about when you go through the air to get to her, a lot of her low normals, none of which are actually included in this bot, are quite jumpable. But you must take the moment where she has taken an action of her own that has missed you and immediately more or less assault or something similar. This means that you need to be able to convert no matter what the precise range of you versus Hilda is at the moment you reach her. Sometimes you need to get over her and do a long move that she's not expecting. Sometimes you need to do no attack from the air and then hit with a low. If your character has good lows, this is often helpful. Sometimes you even have to land on the opposite side of her and see if you're in range to throw because she's not going to let you do anything else. And this all has to happen very fast because Hilda can beat you with her own back jump A, for example, in a lot of situations. In order to keep the bot from running away from you too much, we have substituted something for this of relatively equal concept. Rather than have the bot attempt to just throw out moves that will knock you out of the air, which would just have her spamming them and change your timing. The rhythm of the bot currently is that she will dash after a lot of her moves. She will go into a space control situation and then dash. Now, while normally this would obviously be a moment for you to get as much damage as you can because Hilda has come closer to you on purpose, this is bot practice. In other words, the dash is here to give you the timing sense of Hilda could have gotten away or probably hit a button. And in many cases, this is actually a valid strategy for her to have if she has a confidence that your attack will be weak in some way or whiff. For her to dash at you resolves a lot of her problems, as it takes so long for most characters to get into the air and get started and when they want to do certain things. And her moves are disjointed and sometimes not quite slow but have weird timings on their hurt bosses. You can see here that Hilda is able to get away, and we are using the dash as the representation of that ability to get away. With the aforementioned action 4, if you use the check that lets her do the DP style motion, she may also teleport at times when you're crossing over her head, as it will cause some of the inputs to reverse. This one can do it, but I would not call it a natural thing for the bot to do most of the time. Still, it's quite useful. So with all that said, everything you do is based on this, at least for the first parts. Your aim is to assault, usually having jumped either forward or backward, just to jump somewhere, somehow, to avoid one of Hilda's attacks. And having done so, determine whether or not you have a normal that can hit her. Some characters have good cross-up ones. Some will tend to assault from further away because they have long buttons and don't need assault. And a few others don't cross up at all but still have good setups for this sort of thing, regardless, using other buttons, air buttons that move them forward in the air, and so on. While these are two technically different point systems, you're going to be spending a lot of time doing more or less the same thing. Reposition out of the way of an attack Hilda makes, strike, and then just do it again. However, Hilda can get close to you, and once she does, you may not be in a position to get away that quickly or easily. Or you have managed to get almost to where you need to be and ended up blocking in front of her instead. You can see that we're quite safe here for the most part, as the bot will normally leave the ground before doing certain moves. And unless it's just going to hit normals, which is the lesser thing it does, the only real threat is that it will throw you or do certain cross-up style things. However, Once Hilda is in this position, the player will generally be guarded enough that you have to think about how to open them up. And one of the things you'll often want to do is throw yourself. If you've input this correctly, Hilda will be able to do instant skewer, basically TK skewer, which means that she goes off the ground very slightly before doing it. This move has some interesting properties that you may not see a lot in actual matches, but it helps you understand certain things about the character and certain things about your own timing. First of all, Hilda cannot be thrown when she does this, at least not until she's landed again and recovered almost completely. If you simply respond to her doing this with throw, even the mashiest of throws will fail because she is not on the ground to be thrown there. The patience is also somewhat required if she does the same skewer style move for a lot of your crouching normals. But if you're not crouching, then the TK skewer actually hits you and you have to deal with it. Now this is fine also. The move is negative. In fact, the system is based around this next part. She should generally do the A version of this move, which is unsafe, -10. If she's on the ground and you were standing for some reason and blocked it, you are advantaged. If you crouched, you're even more advantaged. Recognizing which precise advantage you have is important though, because obviously you can't just give up on these things, and she is a character that can keep you in spaces further out slightly than you expected. So if you get too used to punishing this move immediately, you might be wrong about how to do it. In short, when she's right next to you it's easy, when she's a little bit out it can be quite hard. She can also use the C version of that move, but the other point is simply to get used to taking advantage of the fact that you have managed to get close to her and punishing one of her other moves that uses meter. The main one we have suggested is actually quite rare unless you are doing everything else correctly. She can summon a spike from the ground, and when you do that right, this move is punishable in a lot of situations. In general though, you should simply focus on punishing anything Hilda does with meter, as they're often in some way meant to give her advantage to either get back to her position so she can continue to space control, or press a long advantage. Still, your focus should absolutely be on evading first and assaulting in, meaning that most of the time, if you end up standing close to Hilda, it's because you actually failed something else. In the general sense, if you succeeded, unless your character has a lot of really close knockdown, you should have ended up further away from her, and then you simply have to not approach in order to restart the process of getting the points. This is the best way we could find to simulate the stresses you go through against a Hilda player who is skilled enough to keep you out within the constraints of a bot. As you can see, you can often end up being slightly off in a lot of ways. Either your combos don't land in the way you expect them to, the timing is different in some way, or you just miss altogether because she's moved in some way you didn't expect, and nothing to do with your own failure in timing. Well, once again, switching to Hyde. When you are at that range, if you do happen to get caught by any of the attacks she does to stop you from getting in, note that we have specifically not given her her 3B for various reasons. But if you do get caught at the relatively longer range, the bot will tend to maintain some semblance of actual space control, and this is partly why we did not give her the 3B, and instead have her use Skewer for the same purpose, even though it's technically not as great an idea. However, since she does share the inputs with the other bots in this set, she does end up using her dash normals, which are quite good when you are far away, but basically useless and just giving you an opening when she is close. Once again, you need to learn to take this bot more seriously as if you were fighting a Hilda player that was not making these quote-unquote mistakes. Simply put, you cannot really rely on bots to teach you the space control and zoning game that most higher level opponents of these characters can actually keep up, and therefore must settle for just learning the principles. For example, the importance of your assault function or your air forward dash, depending on how you execute it, based on the fact that while you cannot air backdash in this game or just do as you please, you can do that action from any direction of jump, meaning you can jump away from her, jump forward, and so on to get what you need. Depending on your speed and focus, your execution for this can also be compromised in some way. But above all, you can see the main use here is as an advanced method of making sure that when you do have to do a quick jump in attack against an opponent who is perfectly guarding all of your vectors, not just, oh, can I slip to the right space so your anti-air misses. If you are at, I must move now because I'm not going to get another chance, and I have to hope to convert when I land, that is what Hilda is meant to help you with. Similarly, if you realize you're going to go over her head, determine whether or not you can actually hit her, especially if she's dashed, as your options for doing this can be quite limited sometimes. If you do go over her head and instantly launch an attack on your landing, you may find it best, depending on your character, to simply accept anything that hits. The only thing you care about was, did Hilda run into it or not? I.e., did she need to move specifically toward you to to cause the move you did to hit? Or did you have a chance of hitting her? Or perhaps just did hit her? As often, it's not really required that you actually punish her movement, but simply that you are close enough to make sure that you get started, and you have discouraged her from putting out anything that would effectively let her stop you from approaching. Similarly, if she uses invincible moves at certain ranges to stop you, but you have learned all the punishes for those, the same thing will happen. You will be able to gain some advantage from the fact that you managed to get through her space control, even if you went over her head and landed in a weird place. This game has a lot of post-jump normal recovery. There's a whole specific thing you can find on the UNIST system page about exactly how much additional recovery time you have after whiffing normals in the air. But the short answer to it is, if you aren't sure you're going to hit, don't hit anything. And this will speed up your recovery, put you at less risk of being hit yourself, and in certain cases make you able to attack more quickly. This is of course quite the advanced thing to be doing, but they're advanced bots, so this is indeed part of the function. Generally, we have considered that maybe you can put the meter up more to get used to her metered attacks. But eventually you're going to have to get used to focusing on it and not letting her stop you just because she has meter, as this can be a problem in terms of mental state. So far, except maybe in the easiest mode, we suggest not having her meter regenerate, so that you have to pay attention to whether or not she has used a metered move, or is likely to, in order to decide something. And as just shown, you can miss the opportunity entirely due to actually being far away when she does these things. Similarly, it can be very tricky to feel comfortable approaching her at all, as she fills up a lot more space than you'd think. If you are moving toward her, in many cases you actually have to walk to the correct space while blocking, and then make your movement, which gives Hilda a lot of time to do her sort of thing. Since she is not a character that telegraphs her moves or intentions much at all, this just makes it even more stressful. But you will have to get used to this, as no player will let you just jump at them all the time. They'll be expecting that, so you do have to get used to dashing, back jumping, all these other options intended to make Hilda think about whether or not she should do certain things, so that you could then jump over or avoid her relative to those things. Note that skewer is always air blockable, even according to my understanding and experience so far. Even when she launches it from the ground, you can still block skewer in the air. Meaning that she is very similar to trying to get in on Axel from Guilty Gear, for example, where you can just jump and hold air down back, more or less, and block your way through a lot of things. How precisely you set this up and use it is up to you, of course, but you should bear it in mind for when you're really far away and need to approach her from nearly full screen. And if you feel uncomfortable with the walk forward, a simple jump forward may help you sometimes without the actual use of your assault until you're closer. As you can see, neutral jump into assault at certain spaces is actually one of your better tools, as you can still go through a lot of things. These things do still depend on your character somewhat, so do your best to learn as much as you can about how to do it. Presumably if you are fighting this bot, it's because you are far enough into the game to have a decent idea of how most of this is done, and maybe we'll find all of this quite easy. But that does cover our Hilda bot, so we go on through the ranks. Nanasae is also about defense, of course. One of the first things you must learn is which of her things actually need to be blocked, high or low. We did not give her her more powerful overhead of jump C, because generally once Nanasae is in certain positions in the air, you should just be blocking standing no matter what anyway. She is quite anti-airable, but most players will not let you anti-air that easily. If you've input it correctly, she should have the TK version of the move you will find on the wiki as her bullet. And we have a tendency to call Gust. But what we are most interested in at the moment, i.e. for the first set of the points, is her rushing attack, which has different follow-ups and can be pushed so it goes past you, but most of the time it's punishable in some way. You should definitely focus on all the required punishes for it. As your first part of understanding Nanasae as a character and dealing with this bot in general. It doesn't come up that often, and more so you need to be able to deal with it on reaction to it entirely. Meaning that as you'd expect, the rest of the points of the bot are mostly about things that are completely about distracting you from that move and all of its variations. She has her dash B, as you've just seen, which you must block low. She should also have her dash C, even if in some recordings of it you see it less often. And this must of course be blocked standing. Most importantly, the TK bullet / gust will slow you down at least somewhat. Unless you spend a fair amount of time neutral jumping when you believe she's going to approach you. It's not a good tactic for every single character, but those who do not do it have other ways of dealing with the bullet, and you can just focus your training around those things. There's a specific range at which you generally just benefit from neutral jumping against Nanasae. She has really good options at a specific space. The bot does not use these options necessarily. But if you expect her to approach you, neutral jump is almost always a good option. Just make sure you're not right next to her when you do it. If your character does have good cross-ups, sometimes just neutral jumping into nothing in particular can help you both deal with her pressure and other things. Another aspect of this is simply that if you do see that gust bullet coming toward you and have recognized which one it is, the one you're being generally worried about being a relatively slow one that she uses to cover her approach, you can use the neutral jump, depending on your character, to cover her approach in your own way and prevent her from actually being dangerous. Making sure to do neutral jump instead of back jump, however, is important and for beginner play somewhat difficult. She can definitely hit you, but she could hit you no matter what, and jumping forward is generally a worse idea. Nanasae players will generally spend a lot of time making sure that they have spaced themselves such that a forward jump, just directly forward jumping, or assaulting over that attack will lead to you being in trouble. The problem with all this, of course, being that if you do the neutral jump, you still have to be able to convert the damage, which may result in Nanasae being airborne when you try. You can, of course, also do neutral jump instant overhead style attacks if you think she's too close to you, and it will cover a lot of things for certain characters. You can consider this equally valid. Your focus should be to learn how your character deals with that aspect of her game plan, more so than specifically trying to get any given thing. Of the current bots, she is the most likely to actually manage to throw you. And managing to tech her properly is super important, but it's also extremely difficult. Most of what this character wants to do is keep you from being able to touch her while she does certain things. She's one of those characters where you get a lot of hits on her, but if you are not perfectly prepared for converting off them, there's very little you can do in terms of actually out-damaging her to win. Therefore, we did not focus on making sure she doesn't do stray gusts. And in fact, often just care that she does gusts at all, as TK version of the A for that move gives her enough advantages. She might get you to keep quiet, might get the throw, and so on. With the dash B not being overtaken by too much, and the dash C being somewhat rarer in most inputs, there are no points directly associated with blocking these moves, nor punishing them really. A real Nanasae player has a ton of good options for how to deal with things, and just learning to focus so that you deal with her going into the air and don't become too passive is a better overall focus than deal with this specific move or that specific move. Therefore, as you can guess, there is a point for attacking the throw, a point for punishing that move, a point for landing the punish or outmaneuver style attack that comes from the neutral jump. Usually this should be a combo. And when she does fly, completely fly, there's a point more so for recognizing that she has not attacked and countering it. We are not quite sure how we're going to phrase this one because it is a little bit easy to just go, oh, she's in the air, I'll attack her. But one easy way to do it, I think, is probably to make it so that you only get points for doing this if she has gone over your head at the time. This is not necessarily going to be what we actually use, but anti-airing people using things like cross-cut, uppercuts, and similar is an important part of game plans. And she does have some good counters for that, so you expect that to be within the main parameters for it. This is of course more important to Hyde. In fact, the entire flow of it is more important to Hyde, simply because he has to deal with having his own projectile game shifted by hers, and being at risk if he somehow spaces or mistimes his uppercuts. Nanasae also has good range on a lot of things. Not necessarily so much more so than Hyde that it's a footsies problem, but rather that a lot of Hyde's longer normals are themselves punishable and she can do some things. She's generally not that fast in terms of actually landing the punish, but she can check him in ways that mean that he's unlikely to hit buttons to try to get out of anything. And that means that she gets to do all of her stuff. Depending on the input, she will do more of the dash C, which is an overhead as mentioned before, and she will also do more of her uppercut style attack, and occasionally more of her other winding gusts. Not the blast, but rather the up-down one that you've seen before. Understanding her rhythm in a lot of these places, and just taking advantage of this 2 neutral jump in positions where you're not sure what will happen, can help you stay out of certain situations with her fairly easily. She has a lot of good range in the air, but the player has to be expecting you to neutral jump, and even if they do, you have shifted the match to a similar situation on Nanasae's side. They have to be much better at conversions off those attacks than they have to be at standard pressure. Basically, you may not be able to avoid taking damage, you may not be able to avoid getting hit by blocking as easily as you may be able to minimize damage by just jumping sometimes. There are a couple of her mix-ups that this somewhat negates outright. At least until she gets Warble. And as long as you're not standing too close, you shouldn't be able to easily be hit by anything that attacks straight up without the opponent quite expecting it and making themselves quite punishable if they just try to do it quickly on reaction. For certain characters, the same instant jumping overhead, or any move that works in a very similar way, tends to lock down at least some of her options at very specific ranges. So you're better off playing the footsies by just looking to whether or not you should hit that button in the air or not, and otherwise poking at the precise spacings for her jumps with whatever normal is best suited for the purpose. She's the most sensitive to having the inputs off on a given day. She does not necessarily get much worse to practice against. It's still almost always interesting, almost always at least a learning experience in some way, but she can get repetitive and easily punished. Or rather, the way in which she's easily punished shifts, because she's always easily punished. She simply moves a lot more than a player would, and obviously in less safe ways. But this form is probably among the better, as she will more so do so by going into the air and floating around, sometimes actually managing to float backward with her first function, and more or less keep you occupied mentally enough that the things you are worried about are encompassed by her other movement, rather than them being specials that you're just waiting to see them end and move on to the next part. Depending on your timing of the input of action 3, you may in fact even get better versions of her timing in the air. You might get her jump C. You can at least attempt for a variant which would be easy to input for some people after some practice, of holding the third C that you hit in action 3 while doing the dash to get what you need from there. She is therefore good at helping you get used to ranges as a whole, and this form of the flow of a match, where your opponent's aim is to basically control as much space as possible in unorthodox ways. We will not be switching back to Seth for our final bot of the night. In this case, it being the Hyde mirror. Rather than being a bot about defending against Hyde, this is a bit more so about things like corner guard and understanding battle flow. For Street Fighter players, you can parallel this to our Nash bot. It is mostly about just playing, understanding your own autopilot, understanding when you go in too hard on an opponent in the corner or similar. And this bot actually benefits a bit more from that slightly strange input on action 4 that causes him to at least occasionally do his uppercut. But he doesn't really need it to serve the purpose. He has a lot of moves that are either punishable or checkable at very specific timings. And will tend to do that either forward or backward, often enough to take you off guard. This is of course not a key part of the bot's function, but is useful for helping him change your expectations, shift your corner guard perceptions, or to corner guard you in particular situations. One of your basic goals is to use your combos with corner carry after he does certain moves, like that one, to get him as close to the corner as possible and then keep him there. But you can use any method you would like to keep him there. Using the standard flow of the bots as it's been defined so far, this may actually be fairly difficult simply because, while obviously just raw attacking and beating him up all the way to the corner is an option, and it's not even one we discourage per se, he can be a character where this doesn't get you too far. Depending on your own character, it may be too difficult to stick to him well enough to make sure you've got it. Therefore, a lot of what you are doing is learning to respond to his movement, particularly things like dash into that attack, which in most forms of the bot he will use decently often, simply because 5 into 5 does it, 5 playing into 2 does it. Different ranges, but more or less the same concept. He's also quite lightly like Nanasae to dash up and throw you. And you may find that some of the moves you want to use to knock him to the corner end up being quite complicated to actually use against some of his stuff, giving him at least a random-ish chance of hitting you and bringing down your health before you can actually get him there. As a general thing though, he will use his meter in interesting ways most of the time, and you can just take some points for punishing those, that being the easiest form. He will also use his running C or running B as shown there, and you get points for punishing those as well. Once you've gotten to the corner, understand corner guard as a concept well enough to keep him there, and you can take points for that. This is difficult to explain, so this is again why it's an advanced bot. If you don't understand the concepts of corner guard, particularly in this game, there's not enough of a direct explanation we can give you given the differences in the ways characters do it. You should, by the time you're chosen to fight this bot, know whether or not your corner guard was successful. Most likely involves with punishing something he did, or hitting him when he attempts to jump over your head or use a move to get over your head. One easy way to mentally get started, though, is to simply consider it to be anti-airs, but only when Hyde was in the corner when he jumped. And even if you have only a basic understanding of corner guard, that's probably enough to get you started. And like Nanasae, the final point basically is to once again tech his throw. So you're punishing some of his moves similar to our Hyde Bot 1, things like that for example. With your main issues being that you probably want to do heavy punishes with your meter at that point, because it will often be that your opponent has used theirs. And they're two separate things for punishing moves like that. I.e. that one there. His rhythm is slightly different because he does not have certain moves or uses for things, meaning that you will see his 6C more often than you would have seen Nanasae's just because of timing. And learning to recognize it is somewhat important. His 6B is harder to recognize, it was just there a moment ago, it's a knee, and also not really the sort of thing you're trying to punish. Even if you don't necessarily recognize them all that well, most of the time if Hyde dashes into a big swipey button, he's at least checkable if not punishable. So you can treat any hits you get after those as more or less the correct thing. Just don't go for any specials. You're going for normals and main punishes along those lines, aiming to try to get better at the spacing and recognizing what button you should hit based on where he hit you. He's also a character who, as you've just seen, when knocked to the corner, has a lot of good options for attacking an opponent almost instantly to prevent them from coming toward the corner to even manage to corner guard him. So adding this to your understanding should also improve you. It's not quite bulldogging, but it's very close. So some characters who are good at corner carry, but that corner carry involves moving the opposing character very far away from them and then having to chase, will have a bit more trouble with this. And of course the corner guard itself. This can be, if you're unfamiliar with how to corner guard as a whole, treat it as just anti-airing when Hyde is in the corner. And if you're familiar enough with your own whiff punishes and think you understand how to whiff punish Hyde, you can treat whiff punishes of his attacks in the corner as functionally the same. You are also getting the points for that. And finally, the hardest point, tech his throws when he does them. Generally, if he does get out of the corner and you get the chance for the back throw, the best way to get the points is to back throw him back in there. And we do not discourage this either. If you have managed to get your opponent such that you are now the one in the corner, back throw is among your best options for many characters. So learning when you can and cannot do this should probably be high on your list. While this is not quite a kata situation, you can also spend some time learning how to avoid yourself getting corner guarded, as in most inputs of the bot, he will be quite good at this also. Depending on how you did the inputs, the bots are relatively likely to block in wake-up situations, meaning you can at least throw in a couple effects at Oki, but this is more highly dependent on your input fidelity than most things they do. So if you realize that they're really not blocking much or really just being taken advantage of, you might not want to be doing that for that particular day. For those who are not used to games with run or short dash that can have variable lengths, pay special attention to this sort of thing because of the corner guard aspect and how it shifts in games like that, as you are not as able to feel comfortable sticking out even lows to check your opponent's approaches in those situations. You may end up feeling that the opponent is approaching you, and therefore you should actually be somewhat more defensive. But this will often mean that Hyde gets out of the corner. So do your best to not be too stressed out, or end up flinching too much because of this, even given his movement. Similarly, if you are going through the wiki and you find yourself with a bunch of corner combos, those are probably a good thing to practice on this particular bot. As he's more likely to not necessarily get out of them, but increase your stress level on the initial hit and initial spacing enough that it may get closer to the stress of a real match, and therefore show you your real ability to do that combo in a difficult situation. With that, that covers all 4 bots that we intended to actually do tonight. As is customary, we'll run through a couple other characters that you may be able to use these inputs with, and of course show off some of our own ignorance in the process. So far, our data indicates that Lyn does not work as well with this input most of the time. She does have a lot of her movement and mix-ups and so on, but it's not cohesive enough to count as Lyn play, and she mostly just ends up getting all her damage off throws. That said, if you have a particularly odd version of it and aren't doing that well that day for whatever reason, in terms of inputting it successfully for other characters, you can salvage the day's training by just putting it on Lyn and doing some combo stuff, as she will often be effective in terms of just tracking and movement speed. We still therefore have to make a Lyn bot. This is not a suggestion that this is functional as a bot for this character. This basically doesn't work at all. He does a few more things that you'd expect from the character, and maybe you could learn some whiff punishes if you were desperate to understand how to fight him. It's probably better than most of the other bots we've had for him so far. So, if you decided that you really wanted to try after a day of training with one of the others, it's bearable. Whereas before it was basically just ignore it, he's no use at all. As always, Carmine remains Carmine. Though this one is actually fairly good for a lot of things. It's not on the level of a worthwhile bot yet, but similar to Wallstein, it is definitely a lot closer to what you'd expect from the character than anything we've had before. In terms of what would actually function as a point system though, Particularly note that if you are using this with the health recovery off, Carmine actually does lose health when doing things even in this mode. So you can get used to watching that, observing how he flows is a general thing. And there's definitely some functionality in here. So, same as Wallstein, if you want to try training with Carmine, and you happen to have put in the Gordeau type bot, it's not a waste of your time. Orie is already handled, but there is one interesting thing to note for her. If you intend to play against her in more of a footsie style, this sort of works in that it makes you aware of more things. Your mileage may vary, and therefore we suggest that you check it yourself. So far, our rating is not worth it. We do have a Merkava bot in mind. This one tends to mostly just be spammy about that move. But it is at least functional in that it puts down those and moves around decently. Once again, worth a look. Maybe your mileage may vary. But if you've got little or no chance to practice with the character, it is at least enough to help you get used to moves. We're skipping Batista, it just does not work. She has to have her own specialized stuff. Seth and Yuzuriha basically don't work here either, as their entire input set flows in a different way and the system doesn't work well. Chaos, same thing. Because of using 4A plus D in certain things, he tends to just dance around and put out things that whiff entirely. So can be ignored. Byakuya gains a tendency to do normals in neutral. But as you can see, this doesn't specifically make him more dangerous than the other form of the bot. It may be useful to help you get used to punishing things that he does not do in the actual natural Byakuya bot form. But depending on how you input it, he may not use many specials at all, and that would generally mean that you were more successful, meaning that this is another, like Lin, try it out on a day when your inputs are a little bit too much, causing Gordeau to Grim Reaper or similar, and you just want to salvage the time and not spend too much time actually inputting the bot itself. Phonon generally doesn't work. She's functional in the sense that she does all her moves, and she does have a decent amount of spacing, but since the bot moves forward a lot, and she is more a pure zoner than quite the space control zoner, the main thing you'd get out of it is her using that back leap a lot, and there are certain forms of it where she doesn't actually do it that much. So unlike Hilda, where you'd get something out of it, she mostly just manages to keep you out by being repetitive about a motion to go backward. If you have not got any experience whatsoever with this character, and could not get in on someone who was basically just doing that a lot, it may be worth a look especially if you don't feel as if you understand Hilda or feel confident in Hilda, but you can input the bot for her, it might be worth a look to just poke phone on instead. Mika is again not worth it at all. Wagner does not behave correctly in any useful way, partially because we took out so many of her C options and put them in the wrong order. As always for Enkidu, we don't know yet. But this one is generally worse than the others. He tends to be very repetitive, very hoppy, very I can easily see what you're doing. Mainly because his TK stuff has basically no real advantage to it. So without certain things he's just hitting normals a lot and not really effective at all. And of course Eltnam has a very similar flow to her. A lot of hitting normals, hopping around, doing nothing of any real interest or importance. All the pieces are there, but they're all in the wrong places. Akatsuki is really not relevant because there is an Akatsuki bot already. But the main problem with this is that he acts similarly to Phonon. Because his air projectile takes him backward, he mostly ends up shifting in that way or repeating this move a lot, which is much better on characters like Hilda or Gordeau and doesn't affect Nanasae much. But this is relatively substandard compared to what you could have gotten. So we do not suggest doing this with him either. It would probably not be that beneficial to you in any way. With that, therefore, we have come to the end of this Disguidance segment. We will continue our work, and hopefully next week will be another at least 2 bots. I'm not expecting more than 2 as we are reaching the more specialized characters. We're likely to take a much deeper look at either Batista or Merkava. But it's entirely possible we will try something with Eltnam, Lin, and some other set. Still, expect to see Merkava or Batista next week, Friday, same time. And until then, good luck with your training, and good night everyone.